on social reproduction. We are absolutely delighted today to help launch Simanti Dasgupta's brilliant new book, which is Prophylactic Rights, Sex Work, HIV, and Anti-Trafficking in India. And Simanti is professor of anthropology at the University of Dayton in the US, and she previously authored Bits of Belonging, which is a book on information technology, water, and neoliberal governance in India, and published by Temple University Press in 2015. We are also joined by three wonderful readers of Simanti's book, Ashika Chakravarti, who is professor and director of the School of Women's Studies at Jadavpur University. We have Jamie Small, who's associate professor of sociology at the University of Dayton in Ohio. And we have Samina Mullah, who's associate professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Emory University. So I think for a lot of us who've worked on sexuality, sex workers' rights in India, I think the Durbar Mahila Samanwaya Committee is a source of tremendous inspiration. And it has been a group that grew out of a community public health initiative that very quickly was at the vanguard of the Indian sex workers movement. And so we are really, really delighted today to hear a very detailed and thorough exploration of how the movement came about, in its, especially from its earliest to date. And we are really grateful to Simanti for this absolutely wonderful contribution to documenting and putting in perspective for us the sex workers movement in India. So I will hand over to Simanti, who will speak about her book. And then we will have our readers go in order, Ishika, Jamie, and Samina. And then we will open up to a Q&A. So over to you, Simanti.
Prabha, thank you very much. And Amy, thanks for organizing. And thank you all for attending today, friends and colleagues from near and far. And also a huge thanks to Jamie, Oishika, and Samina for taking the time to read my book and comment. I'm really looking forward to that. I do want to begin by remembering Dr. Sarojit Jana, who was very instrumental in terms of the foundation of Durbar. He had a totally different vision of what this collectivization would look like. And it's quite unbelievable for me that he's not with us anymore. He passed away in 2021 from COVID. And I just want us to make sure that, I want to remember him before we begin. It's hard for me to believe that he didn't actually live to see this book. So I want to start by saying that mostly in sex work research, a lot of intellectual energy is spent in the sex work prostitution debate, and that this book is actually intentionally a departure from that. I do acknowledge that because it seems like a rite of passage. You have to acknowledge this debate, but this book is really not about the debate as much. So I have intently departed from the sex work prostitution debate, which I think is not only unhelpful, it also buries the larger political questions of what it means for a historically marginalized community to collectivize for labor rights. In other words, when we center the labor movement of Durbar, I will talk about Durbar in a bit. When we center the labor rights movement of Durbar, it opens up the questions of gender, sexuality, commercial sex for sure, but also migration and mobility. That is, who is a worthy migrant and who is even allowed to migrate for work. This again takes us to the realm of climate change, conflict, pandemics, securitization, and broader control. In other words, what I wanted to do in this research is, of course, look into the sex work movement, but using the sex work movement as a lens to refract larger patterns that are impacting our world today. So I'll start up by setting out the context for the research. So in 1992, following a baseline survey, the All India Institute of Hygiene and Public Health, where Dr. Jana at that time was epidemiologist, and he was charged with instituting what is known as the Sexually Transmitted Diseases and HIV Prevention Program in Sonagachi. Sonagachi is actually a very iconic red light district in Kolkata. and the history of Sonagachi, and we can go into that during the Q&A. And it is quite an amazing place for this. So the All India Institute of Hygiene launched a baseline survey, and this was in 1992, to figure out like the incidence of HIV in India. So this was a good site for this kind of baseline survey tour. One of the important parts of this was that this project, which I will be referring to as the SHIP, the Sonagachi Intervention Project, recruited peer educate sex workers as peer educators. So it's kind of an established model in global health where interventions such as this are kind of introduced through peer education. And one of the main tasks that the peer educators had was to promote the condom as a prophylactic device. However, this otherwise humble myomedical device soon ran into barriers, both biological and social. While the condom itself was relatively new in Sonagachi, most customers habitually refused it, mainly because they suspected it will compromise pleasure for the money that they were actually going to spend. However, the women, on the other hand, that is the sex workers, worried about losing their livelihood if they insisted, so easily relented to the accustomed unprotected sex. Besides, in a hyper-competitive marketplace like Sonagachi, customers could and did simply go to the women who would categorically ignore the condom. Regardless of such internal and external discord, the toll of HIV/AIDS was becoming increasingly tangible in Sonagachi, with incidences of new cases rising steeply, and several were rapidly progressing to AIDS, and finally succumbing to opportunistic infections as tuberculosis, cholera, etc. It was a scary time, as many sex workers later recalled during my conversations with them. They said, but we were going to die anyway, either from hunger or from AIDS. So even for a community deeply familiar with the risk of venereal diseases, HIV/AIDS posed an unfamiliar and an overwhelming threat. To conceptualize a new disease as a new reality and coming to terms with its biosocial modalities, as Paul Farmer has argued in the case of Haiti and HIV/AIDS, is not a very simple matter. That is, it is not simply a question of purely grasping the basic etiology. It requires a recalibration of the everyday, an understanding of the lived experience of the epidemic. As is already well established in medical anthropology, this biosocial approach is salient, especially in the context of underprivileged groups, such as the women in Sonagachi, because of larger issues of structural violence and entrenched inequities related to caste, class, gender, religion, and sexual orientation. The inaugural cohort of peer educators in Sonagachi, who are sex workers, soon realized that their historical stigma as quote-unquote fallen women was also internalized by most of their peers, that is the other sex workers. And it was compounded by the absence of legal rights, an insurmountable barrier to the effective implementation of the condom to prevent the epidemic. However, the process of collectivization was rather arduous and protracted. On one hand, it was marked by internal conflicts between peer educators and the sex workers. On the other, the former, that is the sex workers, the peer educators persisted in their pedagogic initiative to foreground the vital link between health, labor, and livelihood vis-a-vis HIV/AIDS. In specifically drawing attention to structural barriers, and they particularly highlighted poverty and stigma, the prevention program achieved remarkable success in reducing new HIV infections through the sustained use of condoms. For instance, so the SHIP program started in 1992, but by 2022, the UN AIDS reported that the seroprevalence in Kolkata was actually 11%, while in Delhi and Bombay, it was 50 to 90%. And that gives you an idea of like within a few years, like how the condom actually kind of gains traction in Sonagachi and is turning the epidemic around. And by the time I was doing fieldwork when I started in 2011, I have not met a single sex worker who doubted the use of the condom, as the prophylactic device. So I mean, we obviously cannot ascertain the rate of use, but I would safely and confidently say it's close to 99%. So, and similarly, while the UNAIDS reported 11% use, the NACO, which is the National AIDS Control Organization in India, estimated reported condom used among sex workers in Sonagachi, which increased from 3% in 1992 to 90% in 1999. And that's a remarkable success. Most importantly, however, and purposes for my research, that the prevention program extended the HIV/AIDS narrative beyond public health. That is, it drew the state's attention to the corporeal threat the epidemic posed to the labor and livelihood of sex workers. So in one of the chapters, I actually make an argument about risky bodies and the distinction I make it with like bodies at risk, right? So there, the public health narrative is about constructing HRGs, but like risky bodies and kind of this crucible of the contagion. But Durbar turned this actually around and said that the sex workers' bodies were also at risk. So there is an interesting argument here to think about the HRG, but as also vis-a-vis the bodies at risk. This effective rearticulation of the HIV/AIDS as a question of the laboring body motivated the peer educators mostly and other sex workers in Sonagachi to collectivize and found Durbar Mahila Samanwaya Committee in 1995. Just as a little note on the word Durbar, Durbar in Bengali means unstoppable. One of the examples the sex workers in Sonagachi use is like it's unstoppable like the storm. So it's like an unstoppable movement. So in 1995, they formed Durbar. And by 1999, Durbar took over the management of the Sonagachi Intervention Project, and it finally is globally now known as the Sonagachi Project. As a way to de-link from sex work and sex work from trafficking and sex workers' commitment to anti-trafficking, in 1997, Durbar established their self-regulatory board to prevent trafficking of minors and unwilling women to Sonagachi. And in chapter 4 of the book, I actually have extensively documented the work of the board and the rather arduous work of the board and how the concepts of victim, consent, migration, mobility are actually so fraught and so complex when it's on the ground. And in 1997, which means that the year that Durbar established the anti-trafficking board, that same year, Durbar actually organized the first national conference of sex workers in India, which was held in Kolkata. And in that conference, they also issued a sex workers manifesto, which is actually very interesting if you get a chance to read that. And so public health scholars and practitioners, and understandably, endorse the Sonagachi project as a globally replicable model for peer education, community mobilization, and empowerment, especially for marginalized community. Durbar is also upheld as the grassroots initiative to demand the decriminalization of sex work and the amendment of anti-trafficking laws so that sex workers can safely access preventive medical services. However, the public literature thinks of the sexual subjectivities as constructed as quote unquote static and kind of docile to biomedical intervention. On the other hand, the claim of sexual culture is also seen as kind of immutable. So if we were to think anthropologically about the relationship amongst an emerging subjectivity, shifting sexual politics, and a deadly virus, there is an important need to also depart from the dominant public health approach, which in an anthropological sense is kind of limited and in a way that it does not let us understand the complexities on the ground in where sex workers come to need this new subjectivity. And that is the process that I document in my book, is that it's not like one day they just wake up and they just become sex workers. And I'm also not claiming in the book that this new subjectivity is well formed, and it's not, because I can talk more about this, that this subjectivity is kind of emergent and it's also in flux, right? So this book is about exploring the new subjectivity. The book is based on ethnographic research I conducted in Sonagachi and other sites in Calcutta and Delhi from 2011 to 2020. So in terms of my larger theoretical framework, I actually draw upon and extend the post-colonial feminist literature to locate sex work at the intersection of medicine and law, both in terms of their timeline and the emergence of state surveillance on sex workers, HIV/AIDS prevention, and anti-trafficking apparatus are very closely interlinked. Second, I argue that while the medical legal framework enabled the state to recruit sex workers as new medical and legal subjects of rule, it also offered the sex workers the opportunity to recalibrate the relationship with the state based on labor rights. In sum, the experience of subjection and subversion, as I argue in the book, are actually inseparable. More importantly, this is the first time we hear the sex worker speak for herself rather than being spoken for. In other words, she becomes the agent of her own political future. I depart from the existing public health literature, which largely follows a linear approach to understanding collectivization and quote-unquote empowerment. It posits sex work and sex workers as a priori categories. This framework, as I argue, obscures the contestations and collaborations through which the quote-unquote prostitute becomes the sex worker. So one of the chapters in my book is actually kind of tracing the initial phase of contestation that the first group of peer educators confronted within Sonagachi with their own peers, with their colleagues, with their sex workers. And I was very fortunate to actually be able to sit down with them and talk to them extensively during my fieldwork, because several of them actually have passed. And sadly, some of them actually succumbed to COVID. So as remarkable as it is for sexual labor and the question of livelihood take center stage in mid-1990s in Sonagachi, is also not an isolated event. It was a convergence of manifold developments. Obviously, the devastating HIV/AIDS epidemic, the beginnings of global health, on one hand, the resurgence of anti-trafficking discourse worldwide, which resurges around that time and then gains traction around the early 2000s. And finally, I link this work to the larger neoliberal changes in India following the market reforms in the 1990s. In short, Prophylactic Rights tracks this peculiar convergence of medicine, law, and the market that prompted the political reconfiguration of sex work as a site of compelling politics for labor rights. So we see a new relationship that has emerged between the sex workers and the state over the last few decades. Though largely defined by the state, the relationship is characteristically erratic. It is marked by spasmodic fluctuations between collaboration and conflict. While the state has historically surveilled sex workers through medicine and law, which is one of the prime examples of this is the mid-19th century Contagious Diseases Act, what marks the current departure is its simultaneous reproduction of sex workers as both surveyed and surveillance subjects. So sex workers and sex work are relatively new categories in Sonagachi. They entered the vocabulary in the early 1990s when the Sonagachi Intervention Project was launched. Prostitutes who were recast as sex workers by the state following global health guidelines came under renewed surveillance, and red light districts like Sonagachi re-emerged as a crucible of venereal diseases and a place of quote-unquote death. The state, in recruiting workers in the role of peer educators, also fractured the surveillance apparatus, which led to the formation of sex workers surveilling themselves, but also being surveilled at the same time. What was intriguing, and my book actually begins with an ethnographic vignette where the concept of the good worker has emerged, right? So especially being a good worker, what did it mean to be a good worker? Was that the sex worker subjected itself to the state, meaning that every 3 months they have to get tested for HIV and other STDs. They were addressing the anti-trafficking issue. So this idea of the good worker, which in Bengali we like bhalo jono kormi. So this woman who gets arrested by the police, and the peer educators and members of Durbar said, but she was a good worker, meaning that she had submitted to the state demands to be a good worker, so she is deserving of rights. So at the same time, my book also argues that the sex worker identity is not also a monolith. Besides the HIV pandemics, when I talk about the neoliberal reforms in India, India also embraced the market reforms emerging from a debt crisis, which was across the global south at that time. Initially, what began as an HIV public health initiative to categorize sex workers into A, B, and C, based on a sliding scale of income, where A category sex workers are the highest earners to the C category who are the lowest earners. And I can talk more about this. This is actually a very interesting categorization. It's also rather fluid. And interestingly, sex workers actually adapted this categorization and started identifying as either A or B or C categories. And older sex workers who've been in Sonagachi longer before the start of the intervention program, the HIV intervention, actually shared with me that this is actually a new categorization because they had a whole different way of thinking. But what is interesting is that how this neoliberal categorization actually gets also adapted by the sex workers in Sonagachi. In other words, this self-imposed hierarchies signaled the beginnings of the neoliberal market in Sonagachi as well. Thus, worth was intertwined with the market value of being a good and desirable sex worker, but also a good worker, which required self-governance and self-discipline to maximize one's earning potential. On the other hand, in a competitive, hyper-competitive space like Sonagachi, which is fraught with rivalry over customers, the fickleness of beauty standards, etc., the categories are also very fluid. Thus, a sex worker who begins as a category is acutely aware of her impending demotion to the B category, even C, with age. Based on my fieldwork, upward mobility was largely absent. At the same time, the red light district is not a bounded space. Over the last decade or so, with rising rents and predatory real estate capital in the cities, brothel-based sex work has been in wider decline in India. I just want to make a quick note here. A lot of the brothels are actually rent-controlled brothels. So especially the older sex workers live in rent-controlled brothels. But I can talk more about how real estate predation is actually creeping into Sonagachi. Further, the ubiquitous cell phone, a much desired commodity amongst the sex workers, especially the A category sex workers, as a private communication device, has dismantled what was traditionally known as brothel-based sex work in multiple ways. First, a direct line of communication between the sex worker and her customers can now often bypass the dalal or the pimp or even the malkin, who is the brothel owner. Second, it has territorially untethered sex work from both within and outside Sonagachi. Another interesting development in Sonagachi is also the rising number of flying sex workers. The flying sex workers are mostly suburban women, mostly housewives, who come to Sonagachi during the day, as they told me, is like after their husbands leave for work, that they come here, come to Sonagachi to earn some money, mainly to supplement, as they said, the household income. Oftentimes, it was a medical emergency that somebody in the family needed surgery. So these flying sex workers often arranged meeting with customers over the cell phone, rented a room in the brothel, and left once a day's work was completed. Additionally, the materialization of apps, which now drives the gig economy, may soon step into sex work in India like elsewhere. Finally, the labor disruption caused by the pandemic led to further decline of the brothel-based sex work. So this book rests at the confluence of multiple transferences. Taken together, we see the knitting of a web of significance in a Geertzian way where meaning-making as a discursive practice converges and collides. Yet to impose coherence using a simple triad of sex workers, state, and the market would obscure a deeply complex story. Also, the polysemic voice of sex workers, whom we historically hear for the first time as political subjects, belies widespread assumptions of monolithic identities, political stillness, and social stagnation in Sonagachi. When I began this research in 2011, I was primarily interested in anti-trafficking and its impact on sex workers. However, it soon became apparent to me that to confine the work simply to law would be rather inadequate. In almost every conversation with sex workers, HIV/AIDS loomed large, not simply as a deadly illness, but also as their biosocial opportunity for change in Sonagachi. Like other researchers, I also often heard the refrain, quote unquote, "we love AIDS." That is actually very common. So in short, the anti-trafficking discourse was inseparable from that of HIV/AIDS, and in the lived experience of the women, and the relationship between the two was characteristically uneven and unstable. On the other hand, I started realizing that the medical legal regime in India poses a especially interesting conundrum. So on one hand, the National AIDS Control Organization, which is the nodal agency for HIV/AIDS programming in the country, has consistently promulgated sex work in line with the global health. And this linguistic move in the arena is otherwise, which is considered sexually deviant, is actually mainstreamed in the global health. Now, NACO, the National AIDS Control Organization, was established by the state, but it's autonomous, administrative, and financially from the rest of the public health, enabled it to be aligned with the larger global health. And in what is known as the targeted intervention, or TIs, sex workers were identified as a high-risk group and have been included in the national programming. But interestingly, the Indian legal system, which is a colonial vestige, still uses quote-unquote prostitutes and prostitution. So in analyzing this kind of disconnect and what I think is like an kind of uneven and unstable relationship between the sex workers and the state in terms of medicine and law. So I have termed what I call like the risk-crime continuum, where the subject of sex work and the subjectivity of sex workers is produced in negotiation with and in navigation on the risk-crime continuum. So I first locate this as a heuristic device, as an assemblage of related but distinct medical legal components. It is marked by wants and breakdowns between the two realms, that is medicine and law, that offers the marginalized a critical opportunity for scrutiny and resistance. In terms of vernacularization, the sex workers adapt the medical legal language of risk, anti-trafficking, victim, consent, but to align it with the local context. And here, I think Sally Mary's argument about vernacularization is perhaps a bit limited because it does not really explain the supplementary linguistic transference. And what I found very interesting, for instance, is so the word pachar in Bengali actually would translate as trafficking. But sex workers in Sonagachi and Durbar actually makes a very interesting distinction between the two, because the sex workers think pachar as like a interpersonal event. So if somebody was brought into Sonagachi by somebody known, then it's pachar. And that happened in the past. But what is happening now is it's a legal concept, it's trafficking. So some of the older sex workers would tell me, I think I endured pachar, like, I was brought in here, but what is happening now is actually trafficking, right? And I found that an extremely interesting distinction, because otherwise the word pachar actually would translate as trafficking, but on the ground, they actually make this interesting distinction between this. So I argue that this is first to comprehend the new context of the legal regime. And the second thing is also to resist and subvert the regime. So the new lexicon, that is, if we were to take pachar and trafficking, disassembles the unity of the larger governance vocabulary of the anti-trafficking regime or of HIV/AIDS. In short, by stubbornly clinging to the historical mooring of the words, the lived experience in Sonagachi rearticulated to envision a very different future. Second, I locate the risk-crime continuum as a political intervention. While Durbar assented to the routine medical surveillance to prevent HIV/AIDS, and a quick note here that every 3 months every sex worker has to get tested for HIV/AIDS. So there is usually a van that arrives, a medical van that arrives from the nearby public hospital to collect blood. And that's how, when the women actually jump into this van, get their testing done, and that actually is tracked as part of the sentinel surveillance, which again, I can talk later. So every 3 months, they actually submit to this kind of medical surveillance. But at the same time, they also subvert it to claim state protection for labor rights as good, quote unquote, like good workers. The good worker is also a claim as a worthy, rights-bearing citizen of the country. In other words, surveillance and sexual labor co-constituted each other, reworking the discursive framework of both. Finally, my book also talks things about how Durbar became possible in Bengal after all. Because this kind of intervention programs were launched across India, but how does Durbar becomes possible in Bengal needs to be situated in the local history of movements, particularly labor movements in Bengal as well. Thus, in the book, the story and the story of the sex workers' everyday lives, which are socio-politically constituted and historically contingent, in making a strong claim that sex work needs to be conceptualized as a medical legal formation, the work currently challenges sex worker and sex worker as a priori and immobile categories. Finally, coming to the condom, which is another analytic anchor for the risk crime continuum, the condom is the inveterate material and symbolic anchor for my framework. While condoms were really not new in Sonagachi, they were definitely rare before the 1990s. Elderly sex workers had shared with me that a few upper-class men would bring them along. But they, as this what they said, we were not sure what the purpose they served. We simply thought that it was another dami jinish. They just thought this was another expensive thing that the upper-class men would use to enhance pleasure. The prophylactic value of the condom only began circulating in Sonagachi with the introduction of the HIV/AIDS prevention program in the 1990s. Since then, the condom is ubiquitous in Sonagachi, ranging from the clinic, brothel, convenience store, even to the corner, which the betel nut store, which we call the pan stores in everywhere. It's everywhere. I too learned to adroitly navigate Avinash Clinic, the primary site of my fieldwork, stepping over and narrowly passing between boxes of condoms that were piled everywhere. The condom began with a free distribution. That was part of the prevention program. And later, when Durbar took over the prevention program, they instituted something which is called the social marketing of the condom. So it was sold at a minimum of like 5 rupees, and now I think it's about 10 rupees. The materiality of the condom in its biomedical modality and the practice of use, for which sex workers received regular training at state-organized workshops, which I have also attended several of them. Lastly, there were condom jokes that the women shared amongst themselves, and which belonged to the larger repertoire of penile ridicule and phallic mockery. On the other hand, it was implementation of the condom, rather its failure to do so in the initial years of the prevention program, that brought together the women to collectivize for their rights. As one of the first cohort of the peer educators observed during one of our conversations, she said, without rights, we are nobody. And yes, everybody is nobody without rights. But we had no ground to stand upon, which in Bengali she said, "Amader daranor kono jayga chilo na," which said like we had no ground to stand upon. When we asked the customer to use the condom, he would simply refuse, and often asked us, who were we to tell him to do so? And we had no answer, because truly, who were we to tell him to do so? But now, nobody even asks, even customers know that. And I can go into a lot more, because how the care work of condom use is actually placed on the sex workers. And I actually, in a different article, I'm making an argument where it's actually kind of a kinship work, but it's also national work. This is kind of unpaid labor, and I can go into more of the discussion. But just to make a quick note of that the implementation of the condom even today is actually rests mostly on the sex worker as part of the care work, unpaid care work. By the time I was doing my field work, A category sex workers also offered their customers a curated selection of condoms to choose from. As one of them said, it depends on what kind of sexual pleasure they want. The A category sex workers purchased these at a relatively higher price than the usual condoms, which were sold through social marketing, and offered them free to the customers as part of an experience package, alongside alcohol, food, etc. While such packages were not yet formalized as a marketing maneuver or as codified marketing strategy, the condom was slowly transmuting, and this is something interesting where my book actually is ending. It's slowly transmuting from just a public health device to a commodity vital to the sex market and sexual pleasure. So I want to end by talking about how I arrived at the title of my book. So the title Prophylactic Rights is meant to address this risk-crime continuum. I trace an analytic overlap between the prophylactic pledge of the condom as a public health device to prevent an epidemic, and also the law, on the other hand, as the site of justice. Now, this framing may sound that it's confining the rights to just a matter of instrumentality, that it is only with the condom as an instrument that it leads to right. And it also could be reminiscent of just a simple biofunctional approach. But my purpose here is actually different in this book. Instead of positing the condom as just an instrumental tool or any kind of causality, I argue that the condom use, both in terms of its materiality and its symbolism, that the condom use and the labor rights are actually co-constitutive in Sonagachi. And it is interesting also to note that while condom use is ubiquitous in Sonagachi, and its presence is ubiquitous in Sonagachi, there is a way that the women relate to the condom, its successful implementation over the years, and its initial struggle to implement. Somehow it kind of anchors in that kind of humble biomedical device. So kind of thinking about the book as prophylactic rights is almost like the rights as a prophylaxis for social evil, right? Meaning the stigma and the poverty of sex work and the derecognition of sex workers. I think I'll end here, and I'm looking forward to the comments and also questions. Thank you all.
Wonderful. Thank you, Simanti. Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. So we will go to our first reader now, Oishika.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes,
thank you so
you're.
much. Thank you, Simanti, for writing this wonderful book. Simanti Dasgupta's book is written on and written with the sex workers of Calcutta's Sonagachi, more precisely with the collective called Durbar Mahila Samanwaya Committee, a Calcutta-based organization of sex workers. The book is a major intervention in the existing scholarship on sex work and anti-trafficking in India. The ethnographic work is located within Sonagachi, Asia's largest, arguably the largest red light area, and which lies at the intersection of Calcutta's Bidon Street and Shobha Bazaar. As the author meanders along Nilmoni Mitro Lane, Balaram De Street, and Mosjid Bari, she makes us, the readers, part of her journeys and makes us listen to the long sessions of board meetings with peer educators, sex workers, often makes us rush to the Bortola police station to settle a conflict between a sex worker and the police. As she kept shuttling between Abinash Clinic and Polatok Clinic, Nilmoni Mitro and Balaram Street for the routine blood test of sex workers to detect the virus of HIV, AIDS, we made to stand witness the long and random processes of blood testing. We see how the needle pulls out the sample of blood from a disagreeing body of the sex worker, not at ease at all with the intrusive pain of the interfering syringe pushed by the government health worker who does not even trust her blood. But we are not allowed to see the reports which are stored in the locked almirah. The key to unlock the almirah, of course, lies with the stakeholders. Feminist ethnography has a unique flavor and flavor of its own. The book forges an invisible bond of empathetic sisterhood, a sisterhood of victims, as Simanti herself talked and coined this word. And it is created between a middle class, high caste feminist scholar with the laboring sex workers. Simanti shared in a talk at the School of Women's Studies, Jadavpur University, how the outsider's gaze of a little girl from the Bhadralok Bari who used to cross the Central Avenue with a snooping curiosity at the cluster of women standing on the road slowly transformed into an intimate insider's gaze. Thus, the technique, the lunchtime becomes crucial to her work, her research. The time when she sat with the sisters of Sonagachi, sharing their meal and listening to their everyday tales of tears and laughter, Shuk Dukkher Golpo. And slowly the seat of the researcher shifts from the chair to the grass mat, Madur, on the floor, and the methodology becomes more grounded, more intricately intimate. Her English narrative is dotted and punctuated with Bengali words, wits and puns quipped by Didis of Durbar. When rain started, the canopy of cloud unforgivingly enveloped the city sky. The smell of the fish curry mingled with the smell of the antiseptic liquid Dettol, and in the midst of everything, a box full of condoms catches our attention. In the condom narratives, Ritadi strikes a different chord when she says, "But Didi, we love AIDS," as Simanti just said. Everybody is afraid of it, but not us. If it was not AIDS, nobody would have cared for us. It is only for AIDS that we can get a little respect as sex workers. We are no longer prostitutes. The shift is nomenclature may not have changed their status overnight, may not have changed anything altogether. Yet it certainly marked a shift from sex to work, towards a more effective labor rights narratives, towards a corporeal understanding of sex work. And this shift in terminology was absent in early or mid-19th century writings on Sonagachi, the iconic red light area that continued to vitiate, I quote, the moral geography of the historic metropolis of Calcutta. I'm going back to history for a while because the colonial archive and the vernacular sources are replete with fictions, farces, pseudonymous autobiographies, plays written on and by the prostitutes. 19th century authors Durga Charan Rai and Bhavani Charan Bandyopadhyay informed that cheap tart women huddled together in narrow blind lanes as there were 33 houses and 5 mud huts in Sonagachi area, in Chitpur and its bylands of Shinduriyapotti, while new red light areas were fast developing in Harkata Lane in central Calcutta. But official reports further confirmed the spread and presence of prostitutes in barracks, cantonments, forts, and their quarters proliferated the city from Bo Bazaar to Phoenix Bazaar, pushing it further south to Wadgans, the port area. But Sonagachi stood out with its own grand immoral past, hosting and housing, giving birth to fabled dancers, singers, and actresses like Binodini, Indubala, and many others. Sumanta Banerjee and Ratnabali Chatterjee historically traced the social history of prostitutes, which once accommodated any woman who transgressed the fine line of conjugal fidelity and virtue, and that included, the category included rich courtesans, baijis, Nautch girls, high caste Hindu widows, unmarried cooling girls, low caste maids, working women, and actresses of public theaters. And Judith Wakowicz once argued that prostitution was a common occupation for working women of both sides, on both sides of the Atlantic, and a subject of serious historic scrutiny rather than titillating antiquarianism. She places prostitution in the continuum of daily life, not a pathology, but an integral part of the experience of urban laboring class. Wakowicz treated prostitution. I am actually using the term because I'm talking about the time when the shift in terminology was yet to take place. And it was it's more of a word, it's more of a choice of a woman, and rather than the fate. So she restores historical agency to a particular class of women. Among post-colonial feminist scholars, Prabha Koteshwaran's work theorized sex work not just as a form of labor, but as work. She clearly de-exceptionalized sex work and problematized the simplistic narrative of criminalization of the sex industry as a whole. One question that troubles scholars from history to present times, but what led women to take up sex work for survival? The answer is for survival. The choice to make sex a strategy of survival has its historical precedents. Historically, economic hardships and sexual temptations were cited as the most common factors that drove women to take up sex work. Colonial writings and also colonial 19th century vernacular journals and magazines, like in Vidya Darshan in 1942, it carried a letter by an anonymous prostitute of Mecho Bajar, an 18-year-old wife of a polygamous much married Kulin man, high caste Hindu Brahmin, who willfully turned away from the path of devotion due to severe sexual pangs. And the autobiography of Brahmo reformer Shivnath Shastri offered a different story of Thakomoni, a young abandoned wife of once again a Kulin man who joined the brothel for the pleasure of monkeying around. I became a prostitute for Madrami Korte in Bengali. The reasons to join the profession can be many. Actually, there were many and varied. The returns of the district magistrate blamed early widowhood, absence of conjugal life, and destitutions as primary reasons. But eminent novelist Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, in his official capacity as the deputy magistrate of Murshidabad, wrote that high caste Hindu women were particularly vulnerable to seduction, domestic misery, and Bankim added a new word called ennui, or a love of excitement, which made them desert their homes and to become a prostitute openly. Simanti stresses the pathways of the poverty, khider jala, which is unequivocally linked with the women's shared narratives of disposition. The body with empty stomach and without education could be harnessed as a fuel to earn livelihood. Her chapter on laboring Gotor, the laboring body disentangles the riddle. The word Gotor, body, is detached from Shorir, meaning body again, because Shorir is for the pleasure of sex. Gotor is for sex work. Whereas Shorir is for the respectable, for the erudite, and Gotor is meant for the laboring poor, because the educated people, don't use the word Gotor, we use Shorir. The bare body of the poor woman, otherwise capable of hard labor, becomes the only viable alternative of her livelihood. And this body was considered not simply an affront to morality, but a vital aspect of the social economy as well. And through this body comes the disease under various guises, from colonial gonorrhea, syphilis, to the global HIV/AIDS, and then COVID-19 in pandemic times. In 19th century, the prostitute's body embodied the declining moral of the nation, and also, as Linda Need said, the end of the empire. The metaphor of disease was a central component in representing her body and herself as criminal, She was an agent of chaos, I'm quoting Linda Need, as a social victim. Within this mythology, disease was constructed and construed not as a social threat, but an index of the depths to which she had fallen. At this particular juncture, the colonial concern over venereal disease acquired serious dimensions, and the Contagious Diseases Acts 1864 to 68 were implemented to protect the soldiers from the scourge of venereal diseases. With a view of suppressing and mitigating this immoral vice, the law invested the police with the power to invade brothels, houses of ill fame, and public streets where the women were found soliciting. The reports of the Queen's daughters revealed how the women were segregated and examined in the lock hospitals of Lal Bazars of Calcutta to see whether every part of her body was free from any trace of disease. This examination was also termed by Butler as a surgical rape. This was the only way in which the colonial rulers could be sure of providing the British officers a safe sexual commodity. Over time, the contagion changes its faces. Simanti found uncanny colonial resonances with CDA, with NACO, National AIDS Control Association, as she accompanied the sex workers' blood test procedure in Avinash Clinic, as she just mentioned. A woman just said, Didi, the blood is ours. They take the blood and they ignore us. They use the blood for research, and the blood tells them a lot about the virus, whether we have HIV or not. As a sex worker, declaration of the bodily ownership of the blood, the Simanti here ponders over the possibility to retain and perhaps reinstitute the integrity of the female body in relation to hematic surveillance. In this book, Simanti takes the laboring body and the body that gives blood as the primary tool of investigation, and the speaking bodies as her primary archive. These historically diseased bodies of sex workers continue to offer a template for state policing or state policies to combat the contagion of many such diseases. When the police put up a barricade on the entrance of Sonagachi, the cordon sanitaire, which is designed to contain sex workers within their risky zones during the pandemic times, the livelihood of the sex workers did not matter anyway in the official policymakers. The media highlighted the plight of migrant workers, the devastating train accident, but missed the everyday plight and forced migration of the sex workers of Sonagachi, who also forced to migrate to their village or to many such unknown destinations. Simanti's book offers a succinct critique of imperial feminism as well, which perceives sex workers as just objects, as they have no feelings, no will of their own. But the double standard of the Bengali middle class, the Bhadralok, will remain the biggest challenge to achieve the rights and respect that Durbar Mahila Samanwaya Committee underwrites in their manifesto. In a recent protest convention against the rape and murder case of Doctor of Archikar Hospital, organized at President's University, the retired police officer Pankaj Datta, while vehemently critiquing the state government's position, asked, and it was not just a slip of tongue, that how could such an incident of rape happen in a place like Archikar Hospital? If it had happened in Sonagachi, it might have been understandable. While Durbar is committed to the principal R's, that is respect, reliance, and recognition, are we, the middle class elite Bhadralok, ready to recognize their work with due respect? That is why, Simanti, many congratulations for writing this book. This book is a timely intervention on a timeless topic for handling the bodies and the minds of the sex workers with your sharp, sensible, and empathetic touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Ashika, to remind us of the prior histories of regulation of sex work in Calcutta. I think that's a very important reminder. So now over to Jamie for her comments.
Thank you, Prabha. And thanks for having me here. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. And I'm going to open with a spoiler. So this is a really excellent book. and very much needed in the social science research on sexual labor. Kudos to my dear friend and colleague Simanti for delivering such a beautiful text to the world. It was really a great joy to read the book and hear Simanti's voice through the lines. When I first started reading it, I was sitting with a cat on my lap and coffee on my side, and I was like, oh, I can hear Simanti like through these lines. So it was really a lovely experience to have an opportunity to read it very closely. So thank you for writing a good book. And if folks haven't read it yet, please make sure it gets on your list very soon. So probably the greatest strength of prophylactic rights is the ground truthing of sexual labor in India, specifically Calcutta. It's simple and yet a very tremendous intervention. As others have already noted, for way too long, our academic and public discussions alike of sex work have fixated way too much on the choice versus coercion violence dichotomy, which is a really unproductive space to be in. Neither approach is particularly satisfactory in terms of making sense of the social world. And we get in these never-ending loop arguments that are actually quite impossible to get out of. I'm sure you've all had that experience when discussing sex work with students in the classroom, where you just go on a loop and you can never figure out how to get out of it. So to have empirical data that we can refer to and which really maps out the complexity of life on the ground in Sonagachi is just incredible. And probably Simanti herself says it best toward the end of the book. She writes, I do not intend to romanticize Sonagachi, but to humanize it as a place where the women work and build a life and a home for themselves and their children. And to humanize the dehumanized is a great mission in itself. But the Sonagachi case also provides Simanti with a really intriguing intellectual puzzle too. How did these women from a rather loose-knit community go from being prostitutes, a very stigmatized status to be sure, to making a public health claim about their inherent human dignity and normative access to labor rights in a relatively short period of time, no less? And her mezzo level questions include, how did the HIV/AIDS global pandemic create an unexpected opening vis-a-vis the condom for these women to imagine themselves as having greater influence over the terms of their labor and their relationship to their community, their nation, and even the world? Conversely, how did the burgeoning anti-trafficking regime create conditions of constraint and surveillance through which they had to navigate as they were doing their work in Sonagachi? So I'm going to spend most of my time here, and I'll be brief, highlighting what I see as the strengths of prophylactic rights, along with one or two things that I think could be improved. But I want to first start with one tiny story from my own research trajectory to situate the significance of Simanti's book and this longer arc of research. So my primary area of research is at the intersection of law and gender-based violence, but I've also have professional connections to HIV/AIDS and anti-trafficking work. My first solo research project looked at media representations of sex trafficking. When I was looking for a topic for my graduate thesis, I became intrigued by stories of sex trafficking that had emerged in the media landscape. They were everywhere. This was shortly after 9/11, when border security and racialized fear of outsiders in the US were really big issues. And shortly on the heels of when Nicholas Kristof had written what is now a now infamous rescue series in the New York Times. But even back then, as only a little tiny baby feminist, I had this sense that the stories were rather sensationalized, and I kept wondering how accurate they were. And I ended up writing a piece that was published in Feminist Studies, where I did a close reading of 3 films that centered on sex trafficking and their plots. And if you hadn't noticed, there were tons of films about sex trafficking in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The ones I looked at were Lilia Forever, Human Trafficking, and Born into Brothels, the last of which Simanti discusses at length in her book. I conclude that piece by arguing that we need more quantitative data to better situate these cinematic portrayals and to assess their accuracy. And I don't necessarily disagree with my earlier point, but the seductions of quantification, as Sally Engel Mary would say some years later, are no longer quite as strong for me. And if I were to rewrite the ending of that old article today, I think I would actually say we need more ethnographies, all that rich, detailed, immersive, qualitative data of sexual marketplaces around the world, which is exactly what Simanti provides for us, it turns out. because we know that scope and scale studies that focus globally can certainly be valuable, but they are often so methodologically fraught, and even when done very carefully, simply cannot account for the intricacies of local context and cultures. So I want to highlight a couple of the strengths of prophylactic rights, and I'll note that these are just a couple I'm throwing out because we've got limited time here, but these were the ones that really struck me. I think the greatest strength of prophylactic rights is its close attention to ethnographic detail and the beauty of the affection that develops between Simanti and her close interlocutors. This is where the text really comes to life, seeing the women gathered around for lunch, reflecting on their lives, or navigating the alleyways of Sonagachi while on peer educator visits. In particular, Simanti provides an excellent model for describing sexual labor in an ethical manner. It is neither sanitized, nor glorified, nor sensationalized, which is really hard to do because most writers on sexuality and sexual labor in general fall into one of those traps. She presents the situations with kind of a just the facts, ma'am approach and lets the reader draw their own conclusions about the emotional tenor, some of which are heartbreaking, related to some of the cases, to be sure. And Simanti's occasional incorporation of her own emotions in those moments without overshadowing the scenes are also very welcome as well. In fact, by the time I got to the end of the book, I realized that I really would have loved for her to include much greater methodological discussion of her positionality, either a section or a chapter or appendix, to really flesh out this unique insider-outsider status that she holds in relation to Calcutta and the folks of Sonagachi. She mentions it and kind of touches on it briefly at moments, and I know we've had other offline conversations about it, but I think that the methodological angle of this insider-outsider status could really be a standalone piece on its own. And perhaps this is something we can all discuss in the Q&A in a couple of beats. I also want to call attention to the longitudinal aspect of this ethnography. Nearly a decade, Simanti was in the field, off and on when she had windows of time during the academic year. She arrived every year with the monsoon, as one of her interlocutors noted, and being able to trace these processes unfold year on year is really valuable because it provides internal points of comparison and it has the ability to show change over time, which can be harder to manage with qualitative research, just due to the finite nature of the resources available to us. So kudos to Simanti for sticking with this important community for such a long period of time and bringing us this beautiful portrayal of the life on the ground. Another point I want to highlight is the great care in which Simanti lays out the uncanny aspects of bureaucracy that emerge at this intersection of public health and law enforcement. The endless forms filled out and interviews taken, which are intended to chart out and even wrangle the most intimate aspects of social life. I had an internship after college in San Francisco in the HIV/AIDS sector, and I too have many memories of doing HIV counseling and testing with these super long bureaucratic forms that somehow tried to pigeonhole sexual lives into a series of checkboxes. And it always struck me as so strange, such a strange bureaucratic endeavor. So the bureaucratization that Simanti describes in Calcutta feels all too familiar. 2 points of improvement. I wanted to read actually even more ethnographic detail and a little bit less on the theory and background contextual information. I know that sounds wild as a professor to say, but I found myself really drawn to the ethnographic detailed pieces and feeling less excited about the theory. And so this is obviously important content, but the balance just felt a tiny bit off. And so I really loved reading about the details of life in Sonagachi, and I feel like that's the beauty of an ethnography. It brings you to a place maybe you haven't been before, or it reorients you towards social processes that you don't already know about, but which enables you to see them with fresh eyes. And then 2, I want to push back a little bit on what I see as the oversimplification of the US government in chapter 4, where Simanti discusses imperial feminism. Well, I'm certainly sympathetic to the silliness of folks like Hillary Clinton and Gloria Steinem wearing bracelets that say cool men don't buy sex, and the serious limitations of such media and commercialized spectacles in service of feminist activism. I think there are nuances to the organizational functioning of the US government, as well as related multilateral organizations like the United Nations that are glossed over here. And I certainly recognize this isn't a story about those global North sites, but given how much space is devoted to them in Chapter 4, it seems not unreasonable to at least note the greater complexity. And here I'm thinking two things in particular. First, the US government is a rather complex and dense network with a number of different agencies and stakeholders, both internal and external, that would shape the funding streams, some of the funding streams that end up in Sonagachi on the US side, including the Centers for Disease Control, the State Department, and the US Agency for International Development, all of which have their own complicated dynamics with each other and with the presidential administration of the day. But they also very much all shape PEPFAR, the HIV/AIDS funding stream from the US, TIP funding, trafficking in persons, gender equality and women's empowerment funding streams, not to mention civil society organizations and other philanthropic orgs that are located in the global north, like the Gates Foundation, for instance. So I totally understand the impulse to make blanket statements about the nature of the US government. And there certainly is plenty of reasonable critique to be made about the nature of global North donor regimes in relation to global South. And we can really imagine a lot of better ways to address the legacies of racialized colonial harms. The reality is that these organizations, as they currently exist, are complex. And when we miss that, we also miss an important piece of the story. Relatedly, I know it can be sometimes satisfying to dismiss second wave feminists who made cozy bedfellows with the state over the course of largely the 1990s. But I also want to recognize just how incredibly hard many hundreds of civil servants worked for years at the US State Department and USAID, especially in the Office of Global Women's Issues and the Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Hub, just to get gender on the agenda. No one in USG used to even care about it. And from our current vantage point, I think it's easy to take that as a foregone conclusion. But from a historical evolution, it was by no means inevitable. And having worked for 2 years recently as a gender-based violence advisor at USAID, I saw just how much work it took on a daily basis to advocate for the importance of a gender lens in other sectors. Colleagues working in economic growth, food security, democracy, and governance. And it's imperfect, and the global power dynamics remain incredibly fraught. But my sense is that these are inroads of adding a gender lens, adding a lens related to sexuality and other identity categories that are worth fighting for when these funding streams are existing. So I'm going to leave it there, but I just want to emphasize and close that this is an incredibly provocative and excellent book, and it should be of interest to folks, scholars of South Asia, labor, gender and sexuality, HIV/AIDS, anti-trafficking, and many more. So please do give it a read if you haven't already. If you need a break, a book to read on the holidays, this would be a good one to do. So I'll pause there and turn it over to Samina.
Thank you for inviting me, and to our hosts at King's College for for getting us all together this morning. So I'm in the anchor position, which means that I need to say things that haven't already been said. But I am going to echo that I found this book to be an incredibly refreshing read, and as an anthropologist who teaches in a women, gender, and sexuality studies department, I always approach issues of sex worker politics with honestly a type of a dread, right? Because it's such an overwrought and sort of very occupied subject. And this book really infuses sex worker politics and sex worker livelihood with a fresh, clear, and also deeply unsettling engagement. And I mean unsettling in a very positive sense, in the sense that it does not take for granted the kind of oversimplified dicta around agency that is a feature of sex worker scholarship, not just in anthropology, but sort of in this interdisciplinary framework of human rights engagement. And I think it's deeply important that it is located in Sonagachi. And I am not a Bengali speaker, so I speak Hindi, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But that specificity is, I think, very, very critical to this particular work. So what we see is a kind of sex worker mobilization and also their daily lives. And so I'm going to start by saying that I think many of us are like deeply familiar with this turn towards the kind of critical importance of sorting through post-coloniality and post-colonial legacies. But increasingly, I think that really excellent work for which Simanti is setting a standard takes post-coloniality on with some specificity as well, right? And so that means thinking not simply about post-coloniality as a kind of generalized legacy with tentacles into the sort of like neo-colonial formations of everyday life, but actually as one that's rooted in a particular empire that also interacts with a specific geography. And my work is in the US, but if one is an anthropologist, the sort of great corpus of research that undergirds ethnographic history is from India and Africa, right? So, and what we know about sex workers in the anthropological imaginary is so very rooted in Mumbai and the sort of like West Coast formation of that particular city and megalopolis and its particular situation as a kind of coastal metropolis. And there is wonderful work that is rooted in that space and place, but it is critically important to localize post-colonial legacies by thinking through formations of sex worker labor and mobilization in other places that actually seeks not to necessarily generalize what's happening in that particular space, but to actually imagine what it means to inherit in what Simanti, I think, beautifully stitched together as traditions of both subjection and also subversion from a situated geography. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the ways she does that as I move through my comments, which I will try to do very quickly. I also find myself very drawn to the book as not simply an ethnography about sex worker lives and mobilizations, but actually as something that we can broadly read as an anthropological account of state, police, and citizen relations. And I think it's really powerful to think about sex workers as citizens. And in this rendering, Simanti moves very far beyond a kind of simplification of biopolitics through, specifically the node of prophylaxis that she introduces. She's detailed for you in her comments today the ways in which the category of prostitute as both a sort of like state policy and institutional category shifts into the category of sex work and is animated and adopted in very complex ways by her interlocutors. She speaks in great depth and this is, again, about what is deeply unsettling about the techniques and technique of surveillance, which unfold at the intersection of both policing and public health and labor organizing in this particular space. The objects of the surveillance are alternately they're sex workers who are specifically feminized. And there's a really powerful way in which, she alluded to who is deemed a high risk for HIV/AIDS, and whose body remains inscrutable. And so masculinized bodies, because of the class politics, and Ashika talked about this extensively in her comments, right, kind of remain inscrutable to the state. And it's interesting to think about also the plethora of ethnographic work on these sort of grassroots-based mobilizations of HIV/AIDS surveillance. And, in the space of India, again, they have tended to focus on sex workers and also what are often termed hijra communities, right, both in rural and urban spaces, right? So thinking again about like whose body becomes visible to the state. And Simanti includes very subtle kind of encodings of how those feminized bodies are read as particular forms of threat. And this is through the voices of our interlocutors who are constantly thinking through not just whether a sex worker is a minor or consenting or non-consenting, but also whether she's a Muslim or a Hindu, an Indian or a non-Indian, because there's also this subtle border crossing. And all of that expertise and technique is really anchored by the sex workers themselves, who are able to read one another's bodies and perhaps reveal or not reveal what their readings are. So not everything they know is knowledge that they circulate or share. I also think that the text is a masterclass in really thinking through the ethics of relationality, which we give lip service to oftentimes in feminist ethnography, particularly as a kind of inheritance of indigenous philosophy. But it is just steeped in very complex relationships. And this is, I think, the part that often gets kind of sanitized from indigenous philosophy, is that relationality is not all about like love and affinity. It is often about power and difficulty. And so you see these very complicated relationships between Durbar and the police and the sex workers who they are making contact with. And I think everybody has alluded to the trope of sisterhood. And sisterhood within this text it's all over the text. It's embedded in just the way people call each other, di or didi, right? Which is a term that jumps between many different Indian languages. But that sisterhood is a very complex sisterhood. And you can really see in the epilogue when Simanti talks about the time of COVID, what happens when there is a kind of an interruption of that kind of proximity, cohabitation, but also what modes of care are deployed through those same networks of relations. So that epilogue, I think, is a really sharp way of thinking through the way relationality functions all throughout the text. So All right. I'll say one more thing, and that is that, and I had many more things, but I'm just going to say one more thing. I really thought that prophylactics, I can't talk this morning. Prophylactics was a powerful and provocative way to think with the text. And what I love about it is, it's a modifier in some ways. It can be an object. And so we do start with the object of the condom as something that is meant to interrupt or prevent or arrest HIV/AIDS. But when I started thinking about prophylaxis as a kind of signal of how Simanti's interlocutors sort of imagine future horizons and seek to evade the kind of troubles or violences that they see on the horizon. Then I started thinking about their labor movement itself as a kind of way of evading exploitation and criminalization, or as Durbar as a prophylactic against the police, specifically against their predations. There's a very powerful scene in the text in which the women kind of, from the narrator's perspective, sort of in an unplanned manner, when a police truck rolls up, they all sort of rush and start to bang on the hood. And they know that they're going to be harassed and perhaps someone taken. And they manage to sort of banish it. And again, the book is full of these kinds of really amazing moments and scenes. There is also the sort of heartbreaking reality of sex work as a prophylactic against starvation, because all of the interlocutors within this text are really thinking in deeply complex ways. So, there's thinking in the tradition of Michael Lambeck's notion of ordinary ethics. Every single figure within Simanti's work is a really powerful ethicist, making incredibly discerning choices, and you actually get to hear them think through these many choices that they make. So I will end there and say that I think this is a text that also will have a very full life in the world of medical anthropology. If we think about something like these moments where surveillance and disease and clinical resources kind of become moral laboratories, what we have here is a very distinctive work that presents a really particular moral laboratory to kind of voice a range of different prophylactic possibilities that give a description of the ethical choices that one must make as they descend into the ordinary every day. So thank you for writing it, Simanti.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all your really incisive comments, which I think touch upon various aspects of what is a very ambitious book. And I think it gives us a lot of food for thought in terms of, doing our own research. So I think thank you, Simanti, again for your wonderful book. So I think we are almost at time, but I thought we should have at least one round of questions from the audience who've been waiting patiently. Are there any questions for Simanti? Please just go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Rebecca.
So I have two questions. I think we're talking a lot about condoms, and I wanted to know, was there any significant observation you made in terms of the difference in usage between a male condom and a female condom? Did it in any way help women better? Did it give them a better negotiation capability? All those things. So I would like to learn more about that. That is my first question. And the second question is, I would like to understand what happened to the dynamics in Sonagachi during COVID-19, and how did they recover from that? And has there been any change in how they operate? So I'm just asking these questions out of sheer curiosity. And I loved your presentation. All the best for all your endeavors. Thank you, Simanti. Simanti, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right. Simanti. Yeah, thank you so much. All the best.
Yeah. Rebecca, thank you. In my time in Sonagachi, and I was actually there last summer too, the male condom is not in use. So a lot of the condom programming is from the National AIDS Control Organization. So it's very much reliant on like the condom as we know as the condom, right? But more importantly, as I mentioned briefly during my comments, that in all the workshops I attended with the State AIDS Control Organization, which is the state level programming, and they would hold these workshops every year. And during the summers, which I attended, a lot of the programming was actually ensuring that the women are able to implement the condom, right? So that I was saying that the care work, and this is unpaid care work, right? They would not get paid during this time, but that it would fall on the women to make sure that the male customers use the condom. And in that, and I'm actually finishing up an article on this one, and I make the argument that this is because the women, the programming would be like the women would have to say to the male customer that you do not want to infect your wife, and if you infect your wife, then your child may be born with HIV. And so the entire work of this fell under, but I also make the argument this is kind of this public health narrative that also becomes the work of the nation, which falls on the shoulders of a very marginalized group of women. But this was actually the messaging. This is not like covert messaging by any means. This is exactly what the people who would come, bureaucrats who would come from the state organization, state AIDS control organization would actually say, like, you have to say this, like this is the script. This is literally the public health script that they would have to. And after and during the workshop, we would talk amongst ourselves, and I would say like, okay, you are now responsible for making sure that. But it was interesting that they also took responsibility, part of that, as the labor movement. Like this care work was part of the labor movement. So care, and this is something I also mentioned part of the sisterhood, that this care of the movement kind of fell into that realm as well. In terms of COVID-19 was quite, I mean, obviously very, very disruptive for the livelihood. And there was a lot of, I would say, naivety around the COVID-19 amongst the American, because at that time, I was in touch with them on WhatsApp. And a lot of women, like a lot of my didis were saying, oh, actually, we kind of dealt with HIV and COVID is nothing. And, and this actually kind of applied to Dr. Jana, who finally succumbed, because they were all up and about doing, but not, I mean, obviously there was no livelihood. And as Oishika also mentioned, that there was a cordon sanitaire placed outside of Shona, like at the entrance of Sonagachi, like there was actually police check in Sonagachi. And, but at the same time, I mean, then they started realizing that this is a respiratory virus, the approach needed to be different. The recovery has been pretty good. I mean, since then I have visited Sonagachi multiple times. The recovery has been quite good, but at the same time, as I mentioned in my comments, I think one of the big changes that is going to impact sex work in India and elsewhere is kind of the shift away from the brothel-based, right? A couple of things. One is, which I mentioned, the communication technologies like cell phones is one of the important things, but there is increasingly real estate capital that's trying to get into Sonagachi. And for those of you who do not know where Sonagachi is located in terms of the city, and Oishika mentioned this a little bit, it is really in the heart of the city. This is like prime real estate. And so one of my primary collaborator, Purnima actually lives in a rent control flat. She's constantly bombarded by developers to give away her place, but she only has one room, but this entire building would go. But this entire building is actually extremely, we see this in Bombay, in Kamatipura, happening at a very, very rapid scale. We haven't yet seen this in Sonagachi. One of the things about Sonagachi is also not just Purnima, the others, they also have this very astute understanding of the market. So they are, if they were to give up their rent control flat, they would also want something equivalent, if not more, in return. So a lot of the A category sex workers are actually talking about, and this last time I was there in July, and they were telling me that they're willing to give up their rent control apartments. Many of them actually don't have, but some of them who have rent control apartments are willing to give them up to the real estate developers. But in exchange for flat in a couple of flats in Calcutta, but also places in their respective villages where they can actually go back to, but not before they reach their prime. Not after they end their prime, which is around late 20s, early 30s. So there is quite an astute understanding of what this kind of economic transaction might involve. So yeah, Heather, Rebecca, I hope I answered all.
Great. So we have Jennifer. Sorry, Janet. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. That was a real interesting talk, actually. As myself, when I started my career, I started with this work on AIDS control, and I've been part of this sex workers movement in Kerala. I'm from Kerala, India. So I kind of want to kind of know more about something which struck me is a new concept of flying sex work, which was not kind of heard of in those days when I was working with them. So I would like to know about these kind of flying sex workers. What is the kind of income category they come from? So that's something which I would like to know more about it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janet. Yeah, the flying, I have not really worked extensively with the flying sex workers, but their numbers started increasing. And there was also a bit of tension between the flying sex workers and the brothel-based sex workers, right? I mean, but the flying sex workers, as I said in my comments, they're primarily, they say that they are housewives, they identify as housewives, and they come to Sonagachi, they arrange with the client, with a customer on the phone, and then they rent a room, they finish the work. So they usually arrive around 10 o'clock in the morning in Sonagachi, and they leave by, I would say, by 2 o'clock. And the flying sex workers, so Durbar was trying to incorporate them in their movement, but there was, I attended a couple of meetings with the flying sex workers that Durbar arranged, but there was a way that the flying sex workers, not being brothel-based, were not really invested in the movement but Durbar thought this was a bit extractive of their space. And also we have to remember that Sonagachi is an extremely competitive space, right? And I just mentioned in my comments that competition and over customers, but there is another side to this very, very high. It's also over lovers, the babus, which are who are again a whole other dimension. They're very exploitative men who kind of live off of the earnings of the sex workers. So there's also competition over the lovers, competition over customers, and it's a market, right? It's a sex market. And again, the A, B, C categories, which were originally by the AIDS control organization, were then imbibed as identities by the sex workers themselves. So the flying sex workers kind of do not belong to this categorization, but they are a category, right? I mean, and this is actually when I talked to the National AIDS Control Organization, they were actually kind of a bit unsettled by this because their programming was entirely directed to the brothel-based sex work. But here is a mobile population, right? So, And interestingly, the pre-exposure prophylactic, that the two drug regime that that NACO launched was actually with the flying sex workers, not with the brothel-based, because that way they wanted to direct programming towards the flying sex workers, and because they were like just a pill, so it was easier rather than a condom, right? So when I talked, and I did talk to the flying sex workers at that time when the prophylaxis, the pre-exposure prophylaxis was launched, and I did talk to them, and one of the things they said is that it is better for them to be part of this because, the condom is accessible to them, but it would be better for them to have the PrEP so that they can actually continue the work also, and also not be brothel based, because there's also a little bit of a class dynamics going on there. Like Shoishika was talking about the Bhadralok, the educated middle class. So these women were inclined to identify with that identity and demarcate themselves from the brothel-based sex worker. So there was a tension in the stigma of that as well, while they were also. So their attachment to the Sonagachi was, in a way, quite instrumental, I would say. Like they would come here, rent a room, and then go away, right? But then again, as I said, like it created quite a bit of tension between Durbar, who were all brothel based, and the flying sex workers who were kind of more mobile and had to, but it's a whole new.
Yeah. So we have two final questions from Shazia and Shutapa. Yeah, go ahead, Shazia, and then Shutapa.
You're muted, Shazia.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. And I just wanted to hear more about what you mentioned about migration. I feel like you didn't get a chance to talk about migration or climate change. And I just wanted to hear more about that. Thanks.
Okay. And Shutapa?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, can you all hear me? Sorry, I'm at a place with very low connectivity, very poor connectivity, and I've got a bad voice. But before begin with a set of questions, I have a few of them. A big congratulations to you, Simanti. It's a great. I know it is a great work. I haven't had the opportunity to read your book. I have just have briefly gone through the abstracts and all, but I haven't got a chance to read. The cover page looks fantastic, and the fact that it is done by Ratan in itself makes it very special. Yeah. So the first, I think I would just maybe begin with the title of your book. It's really very catchy, but at the same time, I feel that it might also lead to some confusion. And you just pointed out about PrEP, and I know. I mean, for when I saw the title, I said, "Oh, is it to do with PrEP?" And then I got to know that no, it's beyond PrEP. So I feel there can be a little bit of confusion on that. Um, um, and yeah, so like, and we know that it's a very problematic in many ways, the entire the PrEP kind of the exercise that is being at the moment. I think DMSC, that study is still very much on. It's a live study that is going on, and we know there are a lot of debates around it. Yeah. Now, that is one. My second is, now coming to the condom. You talked about the condom use, and I was really interested to know that in while you were working in your experience and in your field work, did you feel that there is, I mean, when it comes to negotiations of condom use, there is a variation among these various categories of sex workers in Sonagachi, and how these negotiations are linked to asserting their rights, and rights, I mean, human rights and the agencies, right? And I would like to know a little bit more on that. Third, I wanted to hear more from you about, when at what point in time do you think sex workers began the language of work and labor? And do you think that this is now this kind of a thought and a politics is limited to only the collectives, the strong collectives, the few collectives that we have in India, or it has really gone beyond, it is that you yeah. And the last one about the real estate thing, because I would just like to point out that as part of our work of laws of social reproduction, and when I was doing my field work in Sonagachi and looking into the property relations, i I touched upon this was a major part of our fine like work. So in terms of the penetration of real estate agencies in the area, it's difficult. It's not the outsider, to my understanding when I was doing the field work. The sex workers, the sex workers, the who are the agrawalis, the ones who are more powerful with lot of money in hand, it's usually they who are buying the properties from the Bengali sex workers, or from the rent controlled, sex workers. So I really kind of, I'm not very sure if it is going to the outside. It is going to remain within the community, but who, that is something we need to think about. And because the women, you are right that they are, and over the years, I think the numbers are also reducing a lot of because the brothel based sex work is reducing. They are now moving out of Sonagachi because of many reasons. And one is definitely that if they are getting good amount, and that money can only be given by the agrawalis and not the regular, like the buyers. That is the reality of Sonagachi. So maybe if you could just, if you think that is something, because that is something that we found in our research, and I think that was quite unique for Sonagachi. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Shazia. Thank you, Shotapa. Welcome. So, Shazia, in terms of thinking about migration, so most of the women, I would say 95%, perhaps 97% of the women in Sonagachi are actually internally displaced. They are forced migrants from rural urban migrants. Several of them are also from Bangladesh. There is a whole brothel in which is known as they call it the Nepali brothel, where Nepali sex workers came after the earthquake, and they thought they would like go back after things settled, but they did not. But they just more. So there is this Nepali brothel as well. So migration is actually very interesting, because recently I was invited to write. Not recent, I mean, I finished that. I was invited to write an annual review article for anthropology on sex work and trafficking. And I actually wrote not about, again, about the very unproductive debate between like whether it's prostitution or sex work, but I actually wrote about mobility and migration, like who is allowed to travel for work and who is not, who is a worthy migrant and who is not, right? Border crossing. So one of the arguments is that with climate change, because a lot of the women who come to Sonagachi come because of agricultural depletion. A lot of them come from Sundarban area, which is the mangrove area, because of the flooding. So a lot of the women are coming. So there is an impact of climate change on that. But more broadly, the figure of the female sex worker as a untethered woman, a woman who is untethered to patriarchal heteronormative formation, is actually itinerant, that she is not anchored anywhere, becomes kind of the figure of this threat of like, larger, first of all, the moral crisis, which has been going on for a long, long time. That's a historical thing, but becomes a threat to kind of national security in terms of thinking about violation, right? So that she needs to be protected, that she needs protection, and so she's vulnerable. But the data shows that actually more men actually migrate. So not as many women, but women migrants, single women migrants are actually more under surveillance than male migrants. And that she's constructed as a victim, not as somebody who is in search of livelihood, not as a worker. So I think it offers a larger lens to kind of think about the wider patterns in the world now, whether it's conflict, whether it's climate change, whether it is larger migration patterns. Like the figure of the sex worker as this hapless, helpless woman who is like needs protection. And what gets buried in the is the question of the structural issues that lead to such kinds of migration. And when you look at migration and climate change, if you look at the, like, and I'm generalizing here a bit, so if you look at the global north and the global south, that might, like, this is a security problem. So if you can securitize the global south, then there will be no migration. If you look at the migration patterns and the maps that depict migration, it is always going from like the global south to the global north, but it's not going the other way. So migration, the threat over the anxiety over migration, border securitization, and the protection of this quote unquote victims kind of get almost embodied in the figure of the female sex worker. And I would stress here the female sex worker who is not anchored in patriarchy and is kind of moving around. Like, you know, the word that comes to mind, she's loitering, right? She's loitering, and is she allowed to loiter? But she isn't loitering. She's actually trying to get work. So that to me is, and actually I think my next project is going to be looking at climate change, migration, and gender, like what that is trying to do. Shutapa, great to hear from you. I hope everything is well. So yes, the title, I have to say I wasn't happy with the title because it felt like a mouthful. I wanted a simpler title, but you're right. It does kind of signal like prep. And but I guess that will lead people to read the book and figure out it's not quite about prep. But I wanted to, you know, as I said earlier, I wanted to look at prophylaxis, as Samina actually mentioned better, explained this better than even I have, is looking at kind of a way to prevent, right? Way to prevent not just a pandemic, just in a global epidemic, but also how can we think about rights. Now, in terms of negotiation, Shutapa, I don't think I have, in my time of the fieldwork, I don't think with 2011 to 20, I don't think that the condom use requires a lot of negotiation with the customer at this time anymore. The one thing I will say is a couple of times what has happened is like elderly sex workers or retired sex workers have, you know, accepted customers without condoms because, you know, they have, I mean, there's a demotion with age and it was hard for them to get customers. So sometimes they have had, and one of them, unfortunately, contracted HIV, which was kind of, because I knew her from 2011, right? I mean, then later on, she was HIV positive. And she later told me that perhaps this was the reason, because she had accepted a customer without condom. Because, I mean, again, you know, the pangs of hunger, you know, khider jala, which is like, she said she had not eaten for like 2 days. So, yeah. So that's, but the negotiation, I haven't really encountered. There are other narratives, but those narratives are really not dominant, because, you know, somebody will say, so-and-so must have cursed her. Like, that's why she's sick, right? Nobody actually uses HIV there. Shutapa, you know this, right? Nobody says like so-and-so has HIV. Like, it's all euphemistic. Like, people would say, the women say, she's very sick. She's very sick. Like, but nobody says that she's HIV positive, right? That it's always euphemistic. Like, nobody's, but but I think that there are, sometimes they would say, you know, somebody has cursed them. Like, you know, they would say, ban mere diyeche, like, you know, somebody shot an arrow but those were not competing with the biological, the etiological ones. Like, they were there, but nobody was making an argument that is what it was. I think by the time I was doing fieldwork, it had actually progressed there. So I think the work labor timeline, in terms of, I think that is where I kind of trace like how it coalesces, right? Because the public health literature kind of says these are the sex workers, they are sex workers. Like, it was not easy. It was not easy. And one of the chapters where I say they were actually, the first group of peer educators were called condom walis. Because, you know, like, you know, machwala and machwali is like, you know, you sell condoms, like you're, and they struggled a lot, and that chapter actually documents their struggle. As I said, I was fortunate to actually talk to all of them during my fieldwork. So the timeline is rather protracted. So there is no one day of that, right? I mean, there is no like this time. But in 1995, leading up to 1995, it's a very short period of time, 1992 to 1995. Durbar is founded in 1995, and next year is 30 years of Durbar. So it kind of goes at a very fast rate, right? Because I think the work of the peer educators, they were relentless. And I think the imagination of a new future, a different future, they were critical in terms of, imagining what could be possible, like reversing not just the epidemic, but also the narrative of public health as a risk to their bodies as well.
Shimati, just a moment. I think, excuse me, I was just trying to maybe mean that whether the language of labor and work remains um, limited to the collectives, and because when you move out of the collectives, when you move out of this, when you go beyond these collectivized women, the very strong, empowered women, and talk to sex workers in general, they really don't talk the language of labor and work in the way that these women. I was just wanting to know that do you think this is the case, because still you hear women saying that ganda kam, it's a very dirty job, it's a bad work, they do not catch, the terminologies are different, but still they do not own it. The whole, the definition of labor doesn't figure out, or that way, the definition of work doesn't fit. They cannot even visualize that. So I was just wondering that if it still remains limited and confined within the collectivized group, and we haven't really made much progress in taking it ahead to the sex workers community in general. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, Shudaba, because the other thing, I would not argue that. I'm not saying that this is complete and it's done, right? That's what the book says, like it's kind of a flux. And this is where our identities emerge and identities kind of travel, contested. So one of the things, Shudaba, even members of Durbar said this to me, that Didi, if you see me outside of Sonagachi, you don't need to recognize me, you don't need to acknowledge me. And I would say, but why would I do that? And she said, no, because it's not going to be good for you, because, I might be with a customer. So, this whole, not only just the Bhadralok thing, like the Bhadralok, the educated middle class and us, but also amongst themselves. It is not like a complete thing. And you're absolutely right. Like if you talk to a C category sex worker, I don't think she's thinking exactly about the labor movement or labor. It's basically putting food on the table that day, right? I mean, so you're absolutely correct about that. Absolutely. The other thing is, Shutapa, about your question about the real estate. I mean, I'm only scratching the surface. Your project obviously looks very deeply into this, but I am only talking to the sex workers I've known for a long time, like mostly the older sex workers who live in who have lived in rent control brothels for many, many years now. So, but they are being approached by outside real estate developers, and also the Agrawalis too, right? So, I mean, that's there as well. But so for Purnimati, for instance, her building is it's a developer from outside. But I'm not going to say much about this because this is very limited knowledge I have, very, very limited knowledge. And what you're saying makes complete sense, that it could be like the more high earning sex workers could. And that's a tradition, right? In Sonagachi, Malkin, sex workers become Malkins. They buy the brothel, right? And then they retire from sex work, but they run the brothel. That becomes the source of the income. So that's a practice already there. But obviously, you are more knowledgeable about this. I was just basing of the very small amount. Like I only know about Purnimati because she's in the midst of negotiating, perhaps. I mean, she hasn't decided. She's in the midst of negotiating with an outside developer. But it's extremely complex, yeah.
Great, wonderful. So thank you so much, Simanti. We are out of time, but I think you've given us a lot to think about, and hopefully we can continue these conversations in the future. So many, many congratulations on your book, and definitely all of us will read it and be in touch for continuing work. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Simanti.
Thank
Thanks,
you all
everyone.
for attending. Thank
Yeah.
you, Prabha, Amy, Jamie, and Samina and Oishika. Yes, thank you very much. Yes.
Thanks a lot. Bye.